So our theme on these Friday get-togethers is that we're hunting for treasures in the Word, because John 5:39 said, again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto treasure hid in a field, the which when a man hath found, he hideth, and for joy thereof goeth and selleth all that he hath and buyeth that field. And we've talked about the fact that a treasure that's hid in a field isn't hid by just being set out in the open. A treasure that's hid in a field is buried in a field. And a man that finds a treasure that's buried is a man that's digging. And that's what we get together to encourage each other and provoke each other to do, is to dig into the Word. So we have talked through the Old Testament history, and I'm not really planning to take a lot of time today. I just want to kind of cap off. We've talked through the Old Testament history. We started with the creation of the universe, and we went through the Garden of Eden, and we went through the Noah and the flood, and then we went through the Tower of Babel and the dividing into peoples, and we went through the calling of Abraham out to be a separated people unto God, and we talked about the family of Jacob, later called Israel, going into Egypt and becoming slaves there. And we talked about the people of God being in slavery in Egypt, being delivered by God and led by God through a 40-year journey in the wilderness to enter into a promised land. And we've looked at parallels. We've talked about how the things that transpired there are allegorical and parallel the experience of God finding us when we were in slavery to sin and delivering us like he delivered the people out of Egypt, but then leading us on a journey from there to a promised place. And I want to emphasize that we are all in a process. All of us are in a process. Even before the deliverance out of Egypt and the crossing the Red Sea, the people of God were in a process. But then even after that deliverance and freedom, the people of God were in a process. And even after coming into the promised land, the people of God were in a process. We are in a process. And as human beings, we have a tendency to view things in the snapshot of the present. But God is viewing things in the perspective of time passing and the process being the point. And I want us to all appreciate the fact that we're at a stage, we're at a developmental process that God is doing in our lives. And we're aspiring to a goal, and we've attained unto some goals, but none of us are finished. I'm not finished. You're not finished. God is not finished with us. We're all in a process, and God is providing treasures in the Word to help us with those things. We looked at the promised land. We looked at the era of the judges and how that the people of Israel became a true nation with a unique leadership of judges. But then after a few centuries, that changed over and became an actual kingdom where they had a king, Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. And we looked at things that we could learn from their individual lives. And then we saw that after Solomon, the kingdom was divided. And let me just throw back for a moment. We saw that even the great heroes of the Bible, we looked at more than one situation like this, but especially David, maybe the most celebrated hero of the entire Bible, had a very, very hard life and went through very difficult things and very troubling things and heavy and hard things that he went through in his life. I've gone through them. I'll probably go through more, and you've gone through them. You might go through more, but David was in a process, and you and I are in a process, and God shows that God does great and amazing things in the midst of the worst situations. He's shown that again and again and again. And that's part of what the Old Testament is for us to learn the character of God, learn the nature of God, and understand to see how he dealt in the midst of Old Testament scenarios, to realize he can deal that same way in the midst of my life as I see aspects of my life that almost seem to be depicted in scenarios, good and bad, in the Old Testament, that God is faithful. God is always there. Sometimes it looks wonderful and glorious. Sometimes it looks terrible, but God is always there and always faithful. And that's a huge takeaway from the Old Testament, that God is faithful in my life and he's there. So after Solomon, we saw that the kingdom was divided, and you had the southern kingdom with the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, 2 tribes. You had the northern kingdom called Israel with the other 10 tribes. Now there is one loose end tribe almost, which is the tribe of Levi, because Levi was the tribe that God set aside for the work of the ministry and did not give a specific region to live. So there were Levites who lived all through both the northern and southern kingdom. They didn't specifically stay in one location or inhabit one location like the other tribes were given to do. So in the southern kingdom, you've got, it's called the kingdom of Judah, and you have the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, plus many Levites. We looked at how both of those kingdoms continued with their own histories, and how there were some tie-ins and overlaps with one another, and how some of that was misguided and resulted in some bad things. We saw how that doing things God's way is the way to stay blessed and the way to avoid problems. And then we saw that the northern kingdom, in being in straying quickly away from the ways of God, headed towards disaster and ended up in captivity to the nation of Assyria. And we also looked at the southern kingdom and how the same thing ended up happening. And they ended up in captivity to Babylon. And so that's sort of where we are right now. And one of the last times we got together, we talked about some of the prophets who were prominent during that time of the captivity, in particular Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And we looked at one specific prophecy in which God laid a word in Ezekiel's heart that he spoke as the Lord, talking about God's perspective on his people and seeing them as sheep without a shepherd, and God's promise that he was to come and be the good shepherd himself. And we looked at how that was fulfilled in the New Testament. And you may remember a New Testament Bible verse where Jesus looked out on the city of Jerusalem and wept and said, I've so many times wanted to gather you, but you wouldn't do it. And he wept because they were as sheep having no shepherd, the Bible says. If we just only read the New Testament stories, we see that compassion of Jesus. We see that emotion of Jesus. We see his love for the people, but we don't necessarily understand that perspective didn't just come up in him that day. Jesus was God manifest in the flesh. And he had been viewing Israel that way for centuries and had put the word into the heart of the prophet Ezekiel to express that feeling and to express that desire. And when he, in the fleshly form of Jesus, spoke that and said, how often I would have gathered you under my wing, he's referring all the way back over the centuries and generations of the Old Testament, where as God, he reached out to his people and wanted to just gather and protect. But it was required that in order to be in that place of protection and gathering, you have to obey and you have to be faithful to God. And the unfaithfulness of the people of God prevented God from blessing to the extent that he wanted to do. And Jesus, in the form of a man, but God in the form of a man, was recollecting all the way back through those centuries and generations, and anyway, that, this is not the lesson today. That was the thing that we got into a couple of weeks ago, but I just feel it's so significant and such an insight into the heartbeat of God. Then now we're sort of here at the captivity time. And I wanted to just give you a bit of an overview of this time frame that takes place here. When you're reading the Bible in the days of the kings of Israel and Judah, you get the beginning and ending of pretty much every king. It says, okay, Ahab lived this long, and then he died, and then this guy took over as king, and you get the continuous story. But then the people of Israel, or people of Judah, the southern kingdom, go into captivity. When Israel went into captivity, we just don't hear about them anymore. And they really lost their identity. Then Judah went into captivity, and we have a lot more stories. And we hear mention of the kings of the kingdoms that have conquered Judah, but we don't really get all the linear telling about those kings. And so sometimes it's a little weird, because it's like you're reading the book of Daniel and you read about Nebuchadnezzar, then all of a sudden, well, it's Belshazzar. And then all of a sudden it's Cyrus that gets mentioned. And you're like, well, wait a minute, I thought Nebuchadnezzar was the king. So I'll just give you a little bit of understanding here of the timeline. So here's what went down. The exile began and the captivity began when Nebuchadnezzar, who was newly king of Babylon, inherited from his father, Nabopolassar, who's not mentioned in the Bible. Nebuchadnezzar became king, had battle with Egypt, which meant, if you know the geography a little bit, well, first of all, understand that when you read about Babylon in the Bible, today we call that place Iraq. That's the same place. It's initially a city of Babylon. And that's a very, very common thing in geography and sociology, that you have a culture and a society that starts out centered in one city and spreads their influence. And then you have an entire state or an entire country that goes by the same name as that city. We've got New York City in the state of New York. We've got Guatemala City, which is the capital of the country of Guatemala. You have these things all over the place. And it's like that country is an extension of that city. Babylon was a city, but then Babylon was a country. But then beyond that, Babylon was an empire. So it's the city of Babylon as the capital of the country of Babylon, which expanded its dominance and was an empire of Babylon with other countries in it. That's Iraq. And if you read about Saddam Hussein, you'll read that he viewed himself as the heir apparent to Nebuchadnezzar, the ancient king, and are celebrated by them as probably the greatest king in the history of the Babylonian Empire and ancient Babylonian history. Saddam Hussein wanted to fulfill his position and reiterate what Nebuchadnezzar had done and had been. So if you know where Iraq is, Babylon, and you know where Israel is, and you know where Egypt is, for Nebuchadnezzar to have conflict with Egypt, Israel's right in between there. So Israel is right in the middle of this battle of superpowers. Judah, the kingdom of Judah is. And at this time, the kingdom of Judah is not a superpower. They had been in the days of Solomon, but they've lost that at this point. And so they're in the tumult, in the throes. Well, in the process of that, Nebuchadnezzar basically kind of conquered Jerusalem, but not in an entirety. And he took a bunch of Israelites away, and he kind of left it as, look, y'all are under me now. This Jerusalem and this Judah is now part of the empire of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar becomes the ultimate ruler of Judah at this point. Although there are kings that he leaves in place, but he also left a general of his to have imperial rule there a guy by the name of Nebuzaradan. So he took away a bunch of Jews, and particularly a bunch of talented and influential Jews, and young ones from important families. Daniel being the most famous, he was taken away at that time, and so Daniel lived his life in Babylon as a part of the government society in Babylon. And God elevated Daniel. He worked his way up. Didn't really work his way up, just God put him in positions to be elevated until ultimately, not right at the beginning here, but ultimately Daniel becomes the second in command. Really kind of fascinating to watch how God has done. Think back to Joseph in Egypt. When Egypt was the world superpower, well, God elevated Joseph to be second in command to Pharaoh, right? God's people, God has placed his people in these positions, even when it's not the people of God as the top, he still puts his people in place in top positions. Kind of fascinating. So Daniel ends up second in command in Babylon. So then there's a second exile and a third exile, which, wow, those things got out. I thought I had dates by them, but whatever. They're about 20 years apart, loosely. It's not exactly, but ultimately he really destroyed the temple and Jerusalem, the walls, and said, okay, because it seemed like they were never completely in line with Nebuchadnezzar, and always sort of leaning towards trying to reunite with an alliance with Egypt. So after Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and during the stories of Daniel and the lion's den, these are stories that you're familiar with. This is when these things happen. Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refusing to bow down to the giant image. That was Nebuchadnezzar. This is the time frame of these things. Well, then you have a series of other rulers in Babylon who are not named in the Bible and who have relatively brief reigns. And then you have a guy named Belshazzar, and there's a story where Belshazzar has a feast and desecrates the things from the temple of God by bringing them in and using them in his feast, celebrating himself as the great God. And so God sent a prophecy to him at that feast, letting him know, hey, you're going to be brought down. And it happened that night, because the kingdom of Persia, which is also grouped with Media, conquered Babylon that night and came in and killed Belshazzar that night. And so Cyrus was the emperor, but seemingly, as near as we can gather from scripture, installed Darius, who was sort of part of his family, not family, but part of his leadership team, instituted him as the sort of sub-king for Judah. Whether he stayed there or not really sure, but officially titled king, kind of like Prince Charles is the Prince of Wales, right? But he doesn't live in Wales. It's not that uncommon to have official position, but you don't really necessarily go there. But Persia conquered Babylon, which meant now Persia, now Judah and Jerusalem are part of the empire of Persia. Well, Persia is Iran. It was actually called Persia until less than 100 years ago, when they changed the name to Iran. But the term of Iran and Iranian as a people is actually more ancient than the term Persia. The Iranians have had a claim to their ethnicity that they feel is extremely ancient, and it's may be interesting to know, I don't know how much of a Bible lesson this is, but interesting to know that they're not Arabic people. And, the Arabic people are descendants of Abraham, just like the Jewish people are. And so they're descendants, if we go all the way back to Noah, they're descendants of Shem. So they're called Semites, right? But the Iranians are not. The Iranians are actually more closely related to Aryans. But anyway, that's not really a Bible lesson, but it's just interesting to be aware for context in some of these Bible things, and then bringing it to our modern day and how our modern day even connects to Bible stories, that the Iranians and the Iraqians, if I put it in Bible language, the Persians and the Babylonians were never friends. And they are not the same people. Now, in our modern day, they both have the same predominant religion, but they're not the same people. So anyway, Persia conquered Babylon, and Cyrus was the emperor there for Persia. Well, Cyrus, God put it in his heart immediately to have a tender place in his heart for the one true and living God, and to recognizing that the people of Judah are the people of God. And he almost immediately issued a decree that those people were free and encouraged to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild. Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed it and said, no, you guys are not going to be the Jews. You're going to be integrated into our Babylonian culture. Now, Nebuchadnezzar did have some appreciation and showed kindnesses to the prophet Jeremiah. And before the end of his life, Nebuchadnezzar issued a decree, because he went through an experience where he was humbled before God. And I'm not going to take time to tell the whole story, but he exalted himself and called himself a god, and then immediately went insane and couldn't even live a normal life as a human until he brought himself under submission to God. And at that point, he, as the emperor of Babylon, one of the great powers of the world, he wrote a letter to the world saying that the one true and living God of the people of Judah and Israel was the God of gods. And so, these things went on in these times. Cyrus comes in already with an appreciation. Daniel, he recognizes the value of Daniel right away. And Daniel continues to be very high in power and influence, even though the regime has changed. And it's now the Persian Empire rather than the Babylonian Empire. So now we get a whole new chain of kings, because these are the kings of Persia. When he issued that decree, there was a return to Jerusalem, led by a guy named Zerubbabel, who was a descendant of David and a forefather of Jesus. So he's in the royal lineage, and he went sort of as the new governor there in Jerusalem. And something's wrong with some of these alignments. I apologize. That happened before 530, but anyway, and they built the temple and got it dedicated. And so things are being reestablished. But when you hear about this summarized, it seems like it happened overnight, that Judah went into captivity. They were in captivity for 70 years, and then they returned and rebuilt, and boom, there you go. But it actually took place over the course of like almost 80 years. I do want to point out one thing really quick, that the return was actually, most people studying history and the dates put it at about 537. The first exile was in 605. Jeremiah had prophesied very, very clearly and specifically that the exile was going to be 70 years. And he had told the people of Judah, you can't avoid this. You need to submit yourself because it's actually the will of God. It's going to be 70 years of captivity, and then there's going to be a restoration that takes place. What I want to point out really quick, looking at these dates, is that it was actually 68 years. So 70 years was a ballpark figure. And I just love the fact that God gave the fulfillment on the early side of the 70 years and not the late side. And God may have you in some type of a holding pattern in your life, God, and it might be the will of God, but your restoration is coming sooner rather than later. And when it comes, it'll be the glory of God. So they return, and Zerubbabel leads the first return, and then there's the dedication of the temple. Then we have the story of Queen Esther, which I'm not taking time to go into all these stories. I'm just giving you an overview of the timeline of the lineage. But the story of Queen Esther is an amazing story. And at that time, the king of Persia was a man that the Bible refers to as Ahasuerus. And these kings had multiple names that they went by. Also, interestingly, the kings of Persia, they called themselves King of Kings because Persia was sort of a federation, and each territory had a king. But then there's the King of Kings. So Cyrus was called Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the Great King, but he also called himself a King of Kings. So there's a little context to God proclaiming himself to be the King of Kings. That meant something to people who heard it in those days. So Ahasuerus was the King of Kings. History calls him Xerxes. And God took a Jewish woman and made her queen over the entire empire. Look, we were talking about earlier how this happened. He just keeps putting his people in place. Not only was she made queen, but her uncle was made second in command, just like Joseph, just like Daniel. Even in this day, he's got another second in command who is of the Jewish people of God. Then 20 years later, Ezra returns and finishes and improves the rebuilding of the temple and reestablishes the law and calls people to repentance from some things that they were already doing wrong after this return. And then Nehemiah returns, and Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the king, who was a different king at this time, Artaxerxes, the son of Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Nehemiah was a cupbearer, which maybe at first glance sounds like, oh, he's just like a very, very menial servant to bear the cup. Oh, here's your cup. You know, seems like nothing, right? But actually, when you stop and think about it, the cupbearer is possibly the most trusted person in the entire kingdom. The reason Nehemiah had a cupbearer is because, the reason Artaxerxes had a cupbearer is because people wanted to poison him. It's power struggles, right? Everybody wants to be king. And so his life is constantly in jeopardy. And so he has a cupbearer who assures that the drink is not poison. And apparently, from what we understand, even will taste it to be sure that he doesn't die. So if anybody who's in a position to kill the king, it's the cupbearer that's in a position to do it. And so you got to believe that all of the opposition, which there's always political opposition, always has been, always will be, that those of the opposition, if they could get to that cupbearer, if they could buy him off, if they could make him promises that would make him disloyal to the king, I guarantee you they tried. He had every promise offered to him. He had every prize offered to him. He had every opportunity, but he had Artaxerxes' trust. And so what I'm telling you is that even Nehemiah was a very highly elevated figure in the government of the empire of Persia. And God just kept doing that, just kept elevating people to the top of the top of the top, even when the people of God are actually in captivity. God still blessed in that way. So Nehemiah returned and got the actual walls of Jerusalem rebuilt. And that's the fulfillment of the return. But if you look at the time from the first return, like I said, it's about another almost 70 years, or in the ballpark of 70 years. So 70 years officially of captivity, but then another 70 years of gradual transition to restoring Jerusalem and restoring the kingdom of Judah, still under Persian rule. So now let's just look real quick at what goes from here. There are no Bible stories after Nehemiah. And there are no books of prophets that were written after the time of Nehemiah. And so that time frame, it's in the neighborhood of 400 years between that and the New Testament. And we call it 400 years of silence, 400 silent years. When Old Testament writings, there's no more being written or written about. And then the New Testament begins to take place, the New Testament stories, 400 years later. What happened in this time? Well, you had the Persian rule. Judah, Jerusalem were under the Persian rule that we just talked about. From there, the Greeks conquered the Persians. So you have Greek rule. And then the Romans conquered the Greeks around 60 years before the birth of Jesus. So when we find ourselves getting stories again, and we call it the New Testament, we're at the healthy youth of the Roman Empire at that time. So what actually did happen? What do we know and understand that took place in this time? There are no Bible stories, but what happened? Well, all of the Old Testament scriptures became compiled and clearly established as a Bible, so that when Jesus was ministering, he used the phrase, the law and the prophets. And he said, hey, you need to listen to the law and the prophets. That's the phraseology he's calling the Bible, what we call the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. Those scriptures were compiled together and recognized as, this is our Bible. These religious groups were formed. The scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees kind of came into their place and functioning in the New Testament time. Also, the scriptures, which were primarily written in Hebrew, got translated into Greek. So at the time of Jesus, there's now not only a Bible, but there's a Bible in Greek. And there's a quest for knowledge through Greek culture, which was largely inherited by Roman culture and celebrated by Roman culture. They loved learning. They loved pursuing knowledge. You think that's by accident? God is doing these things. God is setting a scene. God's creating an appetite to learn and a Bible that's in a language, because also during this time, there was an establishment of a Greek language as universal. Yes, it's the Roman Empire, but it's just not long since the Greek Empire, right? And there's a dialect, and even Greek, if you go from one Greek city-state to another, the dialects can vary, but there has become at this time sort of a universal Greek dialect that people can speak as they travel. Today, it's English. If you travel internationally, you'll find yourself in situations. I've been in countries. I was in Poland one time, and in the same room with me was a person from Spain and a person from Italy. None of us were from Poland, but the Spanish person and the Italian person were having a conversation with each other. And what language do you think they were speaking? English. Neither one of them are English or American. They're not in England or America, but English in our day is a universal language that is used to communicate internationally by people that's not even their language. In the days of Jesus, it was a Greek language that even though people had their own language, they could and did communicate with each other using this Greek dialect. And this hadn't been the case before. Languages were more separating, and now all of a sudden the world is united by the ability to communicate with each other with a universal Greek language. And there's a Greek Bible that they can read. These are important developments that took place before the New Testament could begin. There's dissatisfaction with religion, there's persecution, but then there's also the Roman roads. A very, very major contribution that the Roman Empire made historically was the building of roads to travel from city to city efficiently and effectively. What are these roads going to be used for in the New Testament? To carry the gospel to the whole world. Jesus, I'm jumping ahead into the New Testament, Jesus commissioned his followers and said, you're going to go and be witnesses unto me, and you're going to witness first in Jerusalem, then in all Judea, and to the uttermost parts of the earth. That instruction and command would not have been possible to do 400 years earlier. But now it's prepared and ready. You've got the language, you've got the Bible, you've got the roads. You can now do this. All of these happened. The Romans didn't even understand why they were building these roads. All of these things happened to fulfill the will of God and to prepare the way for Jesus to come and launch the New Testament era and the New Testament ministry. I love the fact that we're doing this today on digital roads that were built in the last few decades. And the people didn't even understand that they're building this network of digital roads to make the way for God to spread his good news across this world in an unprecedented fashion in the era that we live in right now. And because I do believe that we are right in the time of a major, what am I trying to say? It's a major time. Let me just say that. A major time, just like the beginning of the New Testament was a major time in the things of God and the ways of God. So that's how God does it. God prepares things before he does it. And I put on your handout a little throwback to our very second lesson, looking at the days of creation and how they align with each other. You know, God didn't create fish with nowhere for them to swim. God didn't create cattle with no grass for them to eat. He created the oceans and the skies. Then he created the dry land. Then he filled those things. He created the environment first. He created the conditions first, and then he created the things that needed them. And we talked a few minutes ago about how that we're all in a process, and there are things that God has been doing in my life, things that God has been showing me to prepare me for the next thing he wants to do, and the next step he wants me to take, and the next thing that he wants to put in my life. And I'm very, very confident that that's the case with every single one of us here, that God has prepared you for something coming. And it's going to continue to be a cycle in your life that way. And I particularly just wanted to bring attention to that thought process as we begin to get into the New Testament. Because all this preparation was made historically for the carrying out of the New Testament. And now we're about to study it. And I kind of feel like that many of us, there are things that God has been preparing in you for fulfillment, that it's going to take place in some of our New Testament discussions coming up here in the next few weeks. So anyway, I know that's just a lot of information, maybe not as fun just digging into exciting insights of scripture as sometimes we have, but there you go. That gets us to the New Testament, and I'm really excited about what we're going to look at in the New Testament. So I want to just now give, if anybody did, in the process of reflecting, if you were able to take some time over these last 45 minutes or so and think of any things that you've learned over these last weeks or months or whatever it's been for you, any things that you see differently that you would like to share, that you're drawing from us here. Just unmute your mic if you would like to.
Brother Christian, my thought is, with the Greek and the Romans, where did the Latin language come in?
Right. So that was more historical to the Roman people, but they also embraced the Greek language as the language of commerce, because of them basically taking over the Greek Empire. And so the Greek language is already there. So they kind of continue to practice that.
Hey, Christian, this is Rilla.
Yeah.
Sorry, is she done?
I'm sorry, we're not able to hear you super clearly, Sister Campbell. If you had more to say, feel free.
Okay.
I'm asking if the Latin is coming from the Greek.
Right. Yeah, no, unless I'm missing something, I think I have this right. The Latin comes from the Romans. Yeah, the Latin comes from the Romans. And it's a different language family, to my best understanding. Go ahead, Rilla.
Yeah, Christian, thank you so much for all the information. I mean, it's really brought an awareness to things that I hear every day or see, or come in contact with people, like prayer requests and stuff. And the history is just fascinating to me. So I'm looking forward to the New Testament.
Great. Yeah, that's what I enjoy about learning, is the context, like you said.
Hey, Christian, this is Paul.
Yeah, Paul.
I'm driving, so I don't know how well you can hear me, but
We're hearing you just fine.
like,
I'm glad you could make it today. I know you're not always able to make it while you're traveling, so I'm glad you're here.
well, it's I'm surprised the cell coverage has lasted, but it's God's blessing. Thank you for that. I love the way you dig into the history and draw it out. And I guess one of the, maybe a couple things that just keep going through my mind is, one is God's sovereignty. That through all those things that go on, nothing is ever out of his control or his foreknowledge and plan. And regardless of what's going on, he's always with us. And just his love of his people and his continued pursuit of his people. In all those times, he's always there. You said it today. I'm not going to say it like you did, but if we want God to be, we just need to have our hearts with God, and regardless of the circumstances, and just to hope that that's where our hearts need to be all the time. So anyway, good, awesome. Good, well done.
Appreciate that, brother.
This is really good stuff, Christian. I was a history major, and so dealing into this is just awesome. And what retirement has done for me is just been able to get deeper into God's word. You get the world is too much with us kind of thing, and to be able to dive deep. I love the the little nuggets that come in and you know, all those kind of things. You know, as you're going down it, I was an avid reader, but when you start talking, it just brings so much back to my mind. I make little notes. Zig Ziglar on one of his talks said that the nationality with the lowest prison, the lowest number in prison has always been Jewish, always the lowest number. If you look, you know, what nationality, you know, Jewish people always the lowest number, and even if they were, they always held leadership positions. They were, yeah. I mean, it's just as you were talking about that, always just that kind of stuff. Just oh wow, what a deal.
That's amazing. I've actually never heard that before. That's really interesting.
And it's just hello.
Yeah.
And Roman roads, just as a the word pothole comes from the Roman road.
Okay.
They used a high grade of clay, and they always took the clay with them to make the roads. But it was such a high level of clay that people would go out at night and make holes to make pots, and it became a. Now, it has nothing to do with a Bible lesson, but it is just a little.
Yeah, no, very interesting. Yeah, that's awesome. I've always just assumed it was kind of like in the shape of a pot, but that's very interesting.
It was always a high grade of clay.
That all of a sudden was free to the locals, right? That's awesome.
Thanks, Tom.
Yep.
Great.
Well, awesome. Anybody else have anything you wanted to reflect on from anything specific that you've learned, you know, whether it's today or in any, you know, just over the time, or anything that you'd like to share before we go separate ways today?
One more point from me, Paul.
Yeah.
Just the mention of the Roman road and how the roads were being built, the language was unified, the word was the scriptures were there, the Old Testament. And God was orchestrating all that for a purpose, and correlating that to today with all of our electronic wizardry and ability to reach worldwide. And I'm kind of one of those old curmudgeons sometimes who like, I don't want to learn all that stuff. You know, it's more of a nuisance than it's, I mean, I understand, I use it, but sometimes I just don't want to learn another thing. But yet God's orchestrating something there. That was a really excellent point. So, and I want to be a part of it. So,
Amen.
Thank you.
Hey, Christian, can you hear me?
Yes.
On that note right there, what he was just pointing out, I had one of those epiphany moments when you were teaching that. And I'm like, I want to challenge everybody on here, when you get the recording this week, since it was a recap of the Old Testament, I think it would be a great recording for you to try to send out. You know, just pick a number. If you have 7 friends, pick 7 friends and send them that, and just let them know that Bible study is available. If we can get the word out even better, we can build the numbers here and get more folks tuned into what's really going on. And I just do appreciate everything you're doing, my man.
Awesome. Sounds great. Yeah. Very excited about jumping into the New Testament, looking really into the life of Jesus and the purpose of his life, and then how that purpose was unleashed, and just a lot of good stuff. So awesome. All right. Anybody have anything else? All right. Well, love you guys. Great to see everybody. And listen, if you did not receive an email from me today, please connect with somebody else that you know here, you know, that, and somehow or another, if y'all can get me those email addresses so that everybody will be on that, on those blast outs. Okay. All right. God bless. Have a great weekend.